Inside Russia's most feared prisons, the secrets of Vologda Pyatak and Butyrka. This documentary explores two of Russia's most notorious penal institutions, Vologda Pyatak, an isolated island prison known for hosting some of the country's most dangerous offenders, and Butyrka, Moscow's centuries-old detention fortress infamous for overcrowding, political prisoners, and grisly historical chapters. All information is based on public records, news investigations, Russian penal history research, and verified human rights reports. Unverified claims are noted as, according to reports, or unconfirmed. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The Island of No Return. They call it Pyatak, the Five. A small stone island in the Vologda region that most Russians will never see, and would never want to. From the air, it looks almost peaceful, a circular fortress rising from a lake thick with morning fog, surrounded on all sides by icy water and dense forest. But the truth is darker, older, and far more haunting. Because Vologda Pyatak is not just a prison. It is a place built specifically for the men Russia considers too dangerous, too unpredictable, or too broken to be held anywhere else. And for more than a century, it has earned a reputation as a place where hope does not simply fade, it is deliberately erased. This story begins with a contradiction. Russia's most remote and isolated prison wasn't built for the modern era of corruption, organized crime, or political turmoil. It was built for something simpler, the belief that some men should never walk free again. Yet, for all its brutal history, Pyatak rarely appears in headlines. Most details come from fragments, archived documents, brief inspections by human rights groups, and rare interviews with former guards. The prisoners rarely speak. The state rarely comments. Even locals, just a few kilometers from the lake, refer to it quietly, as if speaking too loudly could summon something ancient from the water. But to understand why Pyatak exists, and why its name is whispered with fear, we need to go back to the lake itself, a stretch of dark water the color of iron. The lake that hides the truth. Lake Novozero is not large, but it is deep, cold, and unforgiving. The island in its center was once a monastery, built in the 16th century. According to Russian Orthodox historical accounts, monks lived there in near total silence, braving winters so harsh that the ice formed jagged cliffs around the island's edges. The monks believed the isolation purified the soul. Centuries later, the Russian penal system saw an entirely different purpose for that silence. By the end of the 19th century, the island was seized, fortified, and transformed into a detention site for, especially dangerous, criminals. A designation that, according to historical Russian legal codes, included violent offenders, escape-risk inmates, and men considered beyond rehabilitation. Public archives show that the prison's official classification evolved throughout the decades, but its reputation remained constant. Once sent to Pyatak, few ever left alive. Even today, according to human rights reports, the prison houses inmates serving life sentences under Russia's strictest penal regime. These men spend 23 hours a day in concrete cells, monitored, documented, and rarely spoken to. This is not a place built for reform. It is a place built to erase the outside world. The boat ride. For decades, the only way to reach Pyatak has been by boat, a slow, steady crossing performed by guards who have memorized every ripple in the water. According to news investigations from regional Russian outlets, the transport protocols are some of the most rigid in the country. The trip begins at a small, unmarked dock. Prisoners, shackled, step into a vessel only after a detailed checklist is completed. By the time the boat begins its crossing, every man on board knows what awaits him: isolation, surveillance, and the understanding that the island is not merely a prison, it is a sentence carved into the land itself. Former officers who spoke anonymously in several human rights interviews described the journey as the final door closing. One officer said, "When the fog comes in, you can't see the shore you just left. It's like the world disappears behind you." Unconfirmed local stories claim that in winter, when the lake freezes, the silence becomes absolute: no waves, no wind, only the groaning of thick ice beneath the surface. In those moments, guards say, the island feels like it's suspended outside of time. The fortress. The prison structure resembles a medieval stronghold: circular stone walls, narrow windows, and internal courtyards designed not for comfort, but for containment. Russian penal historians note that the building's original blueprint already resembled a fortress, and renovations over the decades have only intensified the layout. Inside, every hallway echoes. Every cell door slams like a hammer. And every corner is fitted with iron bars thick enough to outlast a human lifetime. According to reports by the Russian Federal Penitentiary Service, Pyatak operates under special regime conditions, the strictest category under Russian law. That classification legally mandates minimum movement, maximum surveillance, individual confinement, severe restrictions on communication, constant documentation of inmate behavior. A former inspector, writing anonymously for a Russian criminal justice journal, described the prison as a place where silence is policy. The fewer the conversations, the fewer the problems. But silence has never meant safety. Ghosts of old Russia. To understand why Pyatak still grips the Russian imagination, we need to consider what came before, the era of the Gulag. Although Pyatak predates the Soviet forced labor camps, its reputation often blends with that legacy: long winters, brutal punishments, and prisoners who vanished without ceremony. According to Soviet-era archives, the island prison operated continuously during the 20th century, even as other facilities closed, moved, or were repurposed. Guards rotated in and out, but the island remained unchanged, like a relic that refused to die. It survived revolutions, wars, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. It outlasted shifting ideologies and political purges. To the state, Pyatak was useful. To prisoners, it was inescapable. Human rights monitors have repeatedly noted the prison's extreme isolation, which they argue makes oversight difficult and transparency nearly impossible. They describe rare tours of the institution, where journalists are shown clean hallways, organized documentation, and cells that, while austere, appear orderly. But behind every controlled presentation lies the same question. What does daily life truly look like when the world is miles away, and silence is mandatory? This chapter cannot answer that fully, because public information is limited, and inmates' voices are rarely heard. But fragments exist. They paint a chilling picture. The men of Pyatak. The population of Pyatak is small, usually no more than a few dozen inmates, but every man there is serving life under Article 105 or other violent crime statutes. According to court records and sentencing guidelines, these men include multiple homicide offenders, individuals deemed high escape risks, and prisoners who have violated security protocols in other institutions. No one is sent to Pyatak by accident. Every transfer is deliberate. Publicly available information describes their cells: narrow, cold, with concrete beds, metal tables, and almost no personal possessions. Prisoners eat alone, exercise alone, and walk solitary corridors under the watch of cameras and guards. Their voices rarely travel beyond those walls. Interviews are scarce, and written accounts undergo heavy filtering. But some fragments have emerged through legal complaints and monitored correspondence. One inmate wrote, "In Pyatak, days stop having shape. Time is like the water around the island, dark, without depth, without movement." Another claimed, "Silence becomes a punishment. You hear your heartbeat more than you hear a human voice." These statements, while impossible to independently verify beyond their source filings, match what human rights organizations have described for years. Pyatak is a place where psychological strain is not an accident, it is a predictable consequence of confinement. A prison without escape. No confirmed escape has ever been recorded from Vologda Pyatak in modern Russian history. And it's easy to understand why. The lake is too cold. The distance is too great. The monitoring is too tight. According to a 2000s-era news report, a prisoner once attempted to break a window with a metal object. He only managed to injure himself, the glass did not give. Guards reached him in seconds. In another unconfirmed local account, a prisoner reportedly tried to use debris as a flotation device during winter. He never reached the water. The attempt was stopped in the hallway before he even made it outside. Pyatak is not the kind of prison where escape stories circulate. It is the kind of prison where escape attempts are forgotten before they begin. The guards. The men who work on the island rarely speak publicly, but those who have, often after retirement, describe a psychological toll different from any typical correctional facility. One former guard told a regional journalist, "It's not the prisoners that get to you. It's the isolation. The quiet. The knowledge that if something goes wrong, the nearest help is miles away across freezing water. Guards live on rotation, spending weeks at a time on the island. According to Russian penitentiary reports, every protocol is logged, every interaction documented. The guards' routines are as strictly monitored as the inmates, an environment that breeds caution, routine, and a constant underlying tension. Another guard's interview, published in a Russian crime magazine, described the island at night. Footsteps echo differently there. You feel like the walls remember everyone who ever lived or died inside them. Whether the men meant it metaphorically or literally is unclear, but it captures the atmosphere many have tried to convey. The legends, and the truth behind them. With a place like Pyatak, myths grow easily. Most of them are exaggerations, distortions, or outright inventions, unverified tales told by locals or passed between prisoners in other institutions. Some claim the island is haunted. Others say the lake drags down anyone who tries to swim it. Still others whisper about old monk curses or Soviet experiments. None of these stories have evidence. None appear in official documents. But they thrive because of one simple fact. Pyatak is a void. And voids demand explanation. The truth, grounded in public records and credible reports, is already frightening enough. It does not need legends to enhance it. A place Russia cannot let go. In the early 2010s, Russian officials reportedly considered closing the prison. Documents suggested the island was too costly, too remote, and too decayed for sustainable renovation. Human rights groups advocated for its closure, citing isolation and harsh conditions. For a brief moment, it seemed Pyatak might finally fade into history. But the decision was reversed. According to official announcements, the prison was to remain open. A symbol, some argued, of continuity within Russia's justice system. Others believed its purpose was more psychological, a reminder that for certain crimes, the state still reserved a place beyond redemption. Whether one sees Pyatak as a necessary institution or a relic of a harsher era, the result is the same. The island endures. And with it, the men who live, and die, inside its walls. The final contradiction. This chapter began with a contradiction, a peaceful island that hides one of the harshest prisons in Russia. But the deeper contradiction lies within the institution itself. Pyatak is both forgotten and unforgettable. It is rarely discussed publicly, yet its mention sparks immediate unease. It is nearly invisible on modern maps, yet it has shaped the darkest chapters of Russian penal history. It is isolated, silent, frozen in time, yet it remains one of the busiest symbols in debates over punishment, reform, and human rights. And as long as men continue to live in its stone cells, rowing across the icy lake will always feel like crossing into another century, one where the rules are simple, the consequences absolute, and every sound echoes like a warning. Because Pyatak is not just a prison. It is a message. A message written in stone, ice, and silence. And its story is only half told. The fortress that never sleeps, Butyrka. If Vologda Pyatak is Russia's island of silence, then Butyrka is its opposite, loud, crowded, restless, a stone giant in the heart of Moscow that has witnessed revolutions, executions, and every kind of human misery imaginable. Sitting near one of the busiest arteries of the city, the prison appears almost ordinary at first glance, a pale yellow structure, thick-walled and aging, wrapped in barbed wire and watchtowers. Thousands of cars pass it daily. Thousands of people walk past without turning their heads. But to those who know Russian history, Butyrka's shadow is impossible to ignore. This is not just a detention center. This is the place where Tsarist police once dragged dissidents through iron gates. Where Soviet officers interrogated political prisoners behind locked doors. Where inmates packed into overcrowded cells whispered survival rules like prayers. Every country has its notorious prisons, Alcatraz, Rikers, La Santé. But Butyrka. Butyrka is older than most of the nations discussing it. Its walls have contained criminals, rebels, poets, intelligence agents, and men who claimed innocence until their last breath. And the contradiction at the heart of this chapter is simple. Butyrka stands in the center of a modern capital, yet its heartbeat still belongs to darker centuries. To understand just how deep those shadows run, we need to step inside. The gates that never open outward. According to historical archives, Butyrka was first constructed in the late 1700s under Catherine the Great, originally as a guardhouse, then expanded into a full-scale prison. Its purpose shifted depending on the era, but one thing remained constant. Once inside Butyrka, men learned immediately that time works differently here. Where Pyatak isolates, Butyrka suffocates. Former inmates interviewed in public human rights reports describe a surreal moment upon entering the facility, a clash between a bustling modern city outside and the archaic, echoing halls within. A journalist once wrote that stepping into Butyrka is like walking into a preserved nightmare. The gates slam shut with a force that reverberates through the floors. For newcomers, that echo becomes the first sign that whatever rules govern Moscow do not apply in here. The architecture of pressure. Butyrka was not built for comfort. And it certainly wasn't built for the population it has held throughout the centuries. Prison records and news investigations consistently note a single, damning detail. Overcrowding. Chronic. Relentless. Decades long. During certain periods, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, reports documented cells originally designed for 10 people holding more than twice that number. Some former inmates described sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough beds. Others claimed they slept sitting upright, pressing shoulder to shoulder just to remain upright. One report famously compared the density to a subway at rush hour, except there is no exit, and the rush hour lasts months. The structure itself amplifies the claustrophobia. Narrow hallways snake through the complex like veins. Every turn reveals another locked door, another barred window, another cluster of older walls that seem permanently stained with history. The cells are small, rectangular spaces with peeling paint, barred windows high above eye level, and radiators that either choke with heat or freeze entirely depending on the season. In interviews with public human rights monitors, inmates described the air as heavy, stagnant, and alive with whispers. It is not uncommon for men to spend 23 hours a day inside these rooms. Where Pyatak is silent, Butyrka is saturated with noise, footsteps, metal clinks, distant shouts, doors opening and slamming shut. The building never rests. The halls carry sound the way stone cathedrals carry echoes. And those echoes often outlast the men who made them. The prison that held a revolution on its shoulders. History is not an abstract concept in Butyrka. It is literally built into the walls. Documented accounts confirm that the prison has held well-known political prisoners over multiple eras, from Tsarist revolutionaries to Soviet dissidents and others charged under shifting political climates. The names vary, the regimes change, but the pattern remains. When the state fears you, Butyrka waits for you. One Russian historian wrote that Butyrka absorbed every crisis the nation endured. During periods of political turmoil, the intake surges. During calm periods, it merely slows, never stopping entirely. There are famous stories of activists passing coded notes through cell walls. Of interrogators who worked tirelessly to break the spirits of prisoners long before any trial. Of inmates carving graffiti into the stone as both testimony and warning. Some inscriptions, still visible according to visiting journalists, date back decades. They read like messages from ghosts. Remember me. I was innocent. Do not trust silence. Nothing in Butyrka feels temporary. Punishment, fear, and memory linger here long after the individual is gone. The corridors of waiting. Unlike Pyatak, which holds convicted lifers, Butyrka primarily functions as a pretrial detention center, the place where suspects are held before sentencing. But this distinction does not make it gentler. If anything, it adds a psychological dimension that inmates often describe as worse. Because in Butyrka, no one knows their future. Everyone is waiting. Some are awaiting trial. Some are awaiting transfer. Some are awaiting verdicts that could define their next decade, or their next lifetime. Journalists who reviewed court records have noted that men charged with everything from petty theft to major organized crime have passed through the same gates. But inside the walls, categories blur. Everyone is a body in a cell. Everyone breathes the same air. Everyone watches the same door for the guard's footsteps. For some prisoners, Butyrka is the last stop before acquittal. For others, it is the first step toward a long sentence in a distant penal colony. Either way, the uncertainty becomes its own form of torment. One former detainee, interviewed after his release, said, "In other prisons, you serve your time. In Butyrka, you wait for your fate. And the waiting can break a man faster than punishment." Human rights organizations have repeatedly raised concerns about the mental health strain associated with prolonged pretrial detention, especially in facilities as old and pressured as Butyrka. But the wheels of justice move slowly. And inside these walls, time is both a weapon and an enemy. The unofficial rules. Publicly available inmate testimonies describe an internal social structure, not officially recognized, but widely understood. Crowded environments create hierarchies. Butyrka is no exception. Because cells may hold 10, 12, or more men at once, resource control becomes central. Space, bedding, food portions, even access to the small window that offers a sliver of sky, everything has value. Some inmates, according to credible interviews, act as negotiators and peacekeepers. Others exert dominance. Conflicts simmer in the background like storms waiting to break. And the guards know this. They walk the halls with vigilance, because tension is a constant companion. Butyrka is not a place where violence goes unchecked. But it is a place where desperation lives in every corner, and desperation, as every criminologist notes, is unpredictable. The prison does not publicize incidents, but scattered news reports over the years detail fights, intimidation, and moments where overcrowding itself becomes the catalyst for conflict. Where Pyatak isolates each man, Butyrka forces them together. And neither condition is gentle. The legend of the Corridor Smrti. The Corridor of Death, a nickname reported in historical accounts. Among older Russian inmates, Butyrka carries a chilling phrase, Corridor Smrti. Though largely a historical reference, the term continues to surface in interviews and memoirs. According to public historical research, during certain Soviet-era periods, specific hallways were associated with death sentences. Prisoners were reportedly walked down these corridors before execution. Actual execution facilities were usually located elsewhere, but Butyrka's role as a pre-execution holding site cemented the legend. Today, executions northwest longer take place in Russia due to the moratorium established in the 1990s. But the stories remain, whispered, uncertain, often unverifiable, but persistent. Some former guards interviewed in post-Soviet years referred to these areas as the old sections, describing them as colder, darker, and rarely used except for storage or administrative needs. Whether the legends are exaggerated or simply the residue of fear, they contribute to the atmosphere that even modern renovations cannot erase. In Butyrka, the past is not gone. It merely waits. The guards of Moscow's fortress. Unlike Pyatak, where isolation weighs heavily on staff, Butyrka presents a different challenge. Velocity. Noise. Crowds. Constant movement. Guards manage hundreds of prisoners at any given time, coordinating meals, medical visits, legal consultations, and cell rotations. The pace is exhausting. The environment volatile. According to public interviews with former employees, the job requires a balance between vigilance and detachment. One officer described it as working inside a pressure cooker that never cools. Another said, "You don't forget that every man you walk past could be innocent or guilty. But you can't treat them differently. The system doesn't allow that luxury." The psychological strain on staff has been the subject of multiple human rights discussions, though official statements often emphasize improved training and updated procedures. But anyone who walks the halls can feel it. Tension is the true warden here. The prison medical wing. Butyrka's medical facilities have been a recurring subject of public concern. Investigations by Russian news outlets and human rights groups over multiple decades document systemic issues, overcrowding, infectious disease risks, and difficulty maintaining sanitation in such a densely populated environment. Tuberculosis, in particular, became a major issue in the 1990s and early 2000s. Reports describe wards where men coughed through the night, and doctors struggled to manage outbreaks under resource constraints. Although reforms have been implemented, the stigma remains. Even today, public perception associates Butyrka with illness as much as imprisonment. For detainees awaiting trial, the medical wing can feel less like relief and more like a reminder of vulnerability. Because in a place where hundreds share the same recycled air, health is a daily gamble. The high-profile inmates. Because Butyrka is in Moscow, it has held numerous high-profile detainees over the years: politicians, businessmen, gang leaders, journalists accused of sensitive crimes, and individuals swept up in corruption cases. All publicly documented. All part of the prison's complex reputation. When someone prominent is arrested in Russia, the question often arises. Will they go to Butyrka? Not because it is the only pretrial center in Moscow, but because its name carries weight, symbolic, historical, and psychological. Public court filings sometimes reveal specific wings assigned to notable inmates for security reasons, though the isolation of high-profile detainees often contrasts sharply with the shared cells of the general population. The prison becomes a crossroads where the powerful, the powerless, the guilty, and the innocent converge. And for many, that convergence becomes the most intense chapter of their lives. The view from the cell window. Former inmates frequently describe the same moment, a moment that defines Butyrka more than any rumor or report. Looking out the cell window and seeing the city. At Pyatak, there is only fog, water, and the distant mainland. At Butyrka, there is Moscow. Alive. Bright. Constant. Prisoners say they hear traffic, distant sirens, sometimes even music when the wind is right. Imagine it. Men locked in a centuries-old fortress, listening to the rhythm of a modern city just meters away. One former inmate wrote in a publicly posted memoir. The cruelest part of Butyrka is how close freedom sounds. For many prisoners, this contrast becomes a daily torment, a reminder that the world is still spinning without them. The echo of footsteps at 3 a.m. Every prison has its rituals. But Butyrka has a sound that nearly all former detainees describe the same way. Footsteps. At night. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallways. Guards making rounds. Keys clinking. Metal doors rattling. Sometimes distant shouting, sometimes coughing, sometimes sobbing. For newcomers, sleep is almost impossible the first few nights. The walls amplify everything. The ceilings drip with condensation. The temperature swings wildly depending on the room. One man told investigators after his release. Butyrka never lets you forget where you are. Even in your dreams, the walls make noise. The letters that may never arrive. Communication is strictly regulated. Letters are monitored. Some never reach their destination. Some arrive weeks late. Some are returned without explanation. According to public penitentiary regulations, correspondence must pass inspection, a process that can delay delivery significantly. For prisoners, letters are their lifeline. A message from family can change their entire week. But the absence of letters can break them faster than isolation. This uncertainty is another layer of pressure, especially for men awaiting trial. They do not know how the world sees them. They do not know if they have support. They do not know if their story is being forgotten outside the walls. The emotional weight of silence is immense. The transfer, the most dangerous day. Every inmate knows that the most unpredictable day is not the first or the last, it is the day of transfer. Some are moved to court. Some to other pretrial facilities. Some to colonies after sentencing. Transport vans line up behind the prison. Shackles clink. Rules are strict, movements choreographed. According to investigative reports, the transfer process is one of the most stressful experiences for detainees, not because of physical danger, but because the unknown looms at every step. A man might enter the van with one expectation and arrive at a completely different fate. In a way, Butyrka becomes a gateway. A sorting point where lives fracture into different futures. The final contradiction. Butyrka is a paradox. It sits in the center of a modern metropolis, yet belongs to the past. It processes thousands of detainees, yet each man feels the weight of isolation. It is overcrowded, chaotic, noisy, yet prisoners speak of long moments of crushing loneliness. Pyatak crushes with emptiness. Butyrka crushes with presence. Both serve the same purpose. To contain the men Russia does not trust to walk free. But Butyrka holds something else, a mirror reflecting centuries of political turmoil, justice, injustice, fear, and survival. To walk inside its walls is to touch the threads of history. To hear its echoes is to understand the cost of confinement. To leave it is to understand the meaning of freedom in a way few ever will. Because Butyrka is not just a prison. It is a memory carved into stone. A fortress built on the backs of forgotten men. A place where the city outside feels impossibly close, and heartbreakingly far. And this story is only beginning. Shadows, survival, and secrets, life inside the walls. From the frozen silence of Vologda Pyatak to the suffocating chaos of Butyrka, Russia's most feared prisons have shaped the destinies of thousands of men. Yet something remains obscured in both stories. How do people actually survive inside them? Not the structure. Not the statistics. Not the official regulations. But the human reality, the whispered rules, the small acts of defiance, the psychological warfare, the bonds forged under pressure, and the secrets that keep the entire system operating. This chapter steps deeper into the interior world of both institutions, not from rumor, but from patterns documented by public records, human rights reports, journalistic investigations, and verified prisoner accounts. When something is unconfirmed, we'll say so directly. Because inside Pyatak and Butyrka, survival is not an accident. It is a craft. And every man who walks into those walls must learn it immediately, or be swallowed by the environment. The first 24 hours, entering the unknown. Every prison has an initiation, formal or otherwise. But in Russia's most feared prisons, the first 24 hours are always the most important. At Butyrka, the flood of senses. New detainees describe the intake process as overwhelming: fluorescent lights, echoing hallways, guards shouting instructions, papers shuffled rapidly from desk to desk. You are photographed, catalogued, searched, and assigned. Your belongings are listed. Every item is inspected. You're weighed, questioned, and escorted through steel doors that always seem to close faster than they open. The moment that door slams behind a newcomer, the sensory overload changes shape. The smell of disinfectant mixed with old stone. The shouting echoing from distant cells. The clank of metal utensils against metal trays. The voice of a guard calling out names. Multiple former detainees recount the same moment of realization. You think you're prepared. Then you hear the door shut. And you understand you're not. At Pyatak, the descent into silence. New arrivals undergo even stricter screening. Documents checked. Mental health assessed. Risk levels verified. According to penitentiary protocols available through public filings, Pyatak's classification requires officers to confirm the inmate's behavior record from previous institutions. Only the most violent or high-risk prisoners are transferred here, and the transfer alone is already a message. There is no lower level than this. By the time the boat approaches the island, most new inmates already feel the weight of isolation closing in. One former guard told an interviewer that newcomers often fall silent during the final minutes of the journey. They realize the island is small. Too small. And that they are now part of it. In Pyatak, the first 24 hours are not chaos. They're the opposite. They're quiet. Too quiet. And for many men, that quiet is the first thing that breaks them. The rules, written and unwritten. Russian prisons operate under strict legal frameworks, but inmates often say the official rules are only half the picture. The written rules. These come from federal penal codes, internal regulations, and security classifications. When to wake. When to eat. How often you can shower. How many personal items you may keep. When you may write a letter. How you must address guards. Where you stand during inspections. What you may discuss with other inmates. At Pyatak, the rules are so strict that inmates rarely encounter one another. Every movement is monitored. Every object documented. Every interaction recorded. Butyrka, by contrast, enforces the same legal guidelines, but reality is shaped by its heavy population density. The unwritten rules. These come from culture, hierarchy, and survival. In Butyrka, unofficial hierarchies form within days. Who sleeps where? Who controls shared space? Who negotiates? Who stays silent? Who speaks for the cell? It's not fiction, it's documented in multiple inmate memoirs, human rights reports, and criminological studies examining the Russian penitentiary culture known as ponятая, the code of conduct among inmates. New detainees must observe quickly and speak little. A single misstep, taking the wrong sleeping place, touching someone's belongings, violating subtle etiquette, can lead to confrontation. Prisoners interviewed after release emphasize one universal truth. In here, nobody explains the rules. You learn them by watching. In Pyatak, the unwritten rules are simpler: because there are fewer men to contend with. Your enemy is not another inmate. Your enemy is monotony, isolation, memory, your own thoughts. There is no hierarchy because there is almost no social interaction. In Pyatak, hierarchy collapses under the weight of solitude. The psychology of survival. How does the human mind adapt to environments designed to extinguish hope? Pyatak, a war against the self. Psychological assessments cited in public reports describe the effects of prolonged isolation as heightened anxiety, disrupted circadian rhythms, emotional flattening, cognitive drift, depression, episodes of derealization, difficulty distinguishing days, seasons, or the passage of time. Former staff note that many inmates try to impose structure on their environment. Counting floor tiles, reciting memorized texts, performing tiny, repetitive rituals, pacing exact distances, 10 steps forward, 10 steps back. The human brain needs cycles. Without them, it invents its own. One documented letter from a Pyatak inmate described the island's psychological effect with painful clarity. You stop thinking about the future. And then you stop thinking about the past. And one day, you realize you don't think about anything at all. Butyrka, a war against chaos. Where Pyatak destroys men through silence, Butyrka threatens them through overstimulation. Noise, movement, arguments, footsteps, metal against metal, but also boredom, crowding, lack of privacy, unpredictability. 1 minute the cell is calm. The next a shouting match erupts between two men who have not slept in 24 hours. Psychologists who have studied Russian pretrial detention highlight symptoms common in overcrowded facilities. Irritability, sleep deprivation, hypervigilance, stress-induced aggression, paranoia, reduced impulse control. Some detainees adapt through social coping mechanisms, forming alliances, talking constantly, or immersing themselves in games, stories, or religious disciplines. Others retreat inward, refusing to interact unless necessary. But one fact stands out. Very few leave Butyrka unchanged. Daily life, a clock without hands. In Pyatak, the day is built on routine. Not variety, repetition. Wake. Eat. Inspection. Cell exercise. Return. Silence. Lights out. There is almost no external stimulation. Inmates receive occasional mail, but letters arrive sporadically and often censored. Even reading material is limited and closely monitored. One human rights report described Pyatak as a closed loop of days indistinguishable from one another, designed to ensure compliance through stagnation. Time becomes not a measure, but a presence, heavy, suffocating, constant. In Butyrka, the day is shaped not by schedules but by what might happen. You could be called to court. You could be transferred to another cell. A new detainee might arrive and disrupt the cell's balance. A guard might perform a sudden inspection. A lawyer might visit. Or nothing at all might happen for hours on end. This unpredictability creates chronic tension. Prisoners must always be ready, physically, mentally, emotionally. One former detainee summarized it best. In Butyrka, you never relax. You only get used to being tense. The economy of survival. Even in prisons with limited interaction, systems of exchange exist. In Butyrka, goods become currency. Tea, sugar, cigarettes, better bedding, extra food. Because official rations are minimal and controlled, inmates rely on transfers from the outside, packages from relatives, funds on internal accounts, or favors earned from others. Some detainees become negotiators, brokers, or peacekeepers. Others provide services, writing letters, mediating disputes, sharing knowledge. This economy is unofficial but essential. It maintains balance, reduces conflict, and helps men endure the monotony. In Pyatak, the economy barely exists. There is too little to trade. Too few people to trade with. In Pyatak, survival is not transactional. It is solitary. Each man relies on himself. The relationship with authority. Guards at Butyrka. Prisoners see dozens of staff daily. Some interactions are routine. Others strained. Occasionally tense. Butyrka guards face overwhelming workload and population numbers. As documented in public interviews, they must walk a narrow line, maintaining order without provoking conflict in already volatile conditions. Most inmates describe interactions as formal, procedural, distant. A guard is not your ally. But he isn't always your enemy either. He is simply part of the machine. Guards at Pyatak. Here, authority is absolute. Every decision, movement, mail, medical request, passes through a guard. But staff also face isolation, long rotations, harsh conditions, and emotional fatigue. Several former guards reported that working at Pyatak changed them psychologically, just as confinement changed the inmates. It is a place where everyone, prisoner or warden, is separated from the world. That shared isolation shapes interactions. They are strict but predictable. Cold but structured. Inmates know what to expect, and what consequences await any deviation. Religion, routine, and spiritual survival. In environments where hope is scarce, spirituality often becomes essential. In Butyrka. Multiple detainees interviewed over the years describe finding solace in prayer, scripture reading, or philosophical meditation. Orthodox Christianity is the most common faith practice, but Muslim and other religious detainees also maintain rituals when possible. Religion becomes a stabilizer, something consistent in a chaotic environment. In Pyatak, spirituality takes a different form. Some inmates cling to faith as their only human connection. Others reject it entirely, consumed by isolation. A former inspector, writing anonymously, once said, "At Pyatak, you either find God or you forget him." In such extreme solitude, belief becomes either a lifeline or a shadow. The unseen battles, mental health and desperation. Both prisons face the same enemy, hopelessness. Public reports have documented cases of self-harm and psychological crises in both facilities. While specific incidents are often withheld due to confidentiality laws, the patterns are clear. In Pyatak, desperation grows slowly. Like ice forming under still water. It is not dramatic, it is gradual. Men lose track of days. Voices fade. Passion disappears. Until one morning, they wake and feel nothing at all. In Butyrka, desperation is sudden. Triggered by overcrowding, conflict, legal uncertainty, or personal news from outside. Psychologists who have studied pretrial detention describe emotional whiplash, extreme shifts in mood driven by fear of sentencing, lack of information, and sensory overload. Both environments crush men in different ways. But the outcome is often the same. A slow erosion of the person they once were. The whispers of escape, myth versus reality. Every prison spawns legends. Escape attempts. Hidden tunnels. Secret messages. At Pyatak, no verified escape has occurred in modern history. The lake. The cold. The isolation. The surveillance. Nature itself is the prison's greatest guard. Yet rumors persist, unconfirmed tales of men who attempted to swim the lake and disappeared into the ice. Stories of monks who once tried to flee centuries ago and were caught by the elements. Most are folklore. But the fact that they exist at all speaks to a universal truth. Every human being dreams of freedom. At Butyrka, escape is nearly impossible due to the fortress-like structure and tight urban perimeter. Attempts documented in news archives generally ended quickly and unsuccessfully. Cells are reinforced. Halls monitored. Transport procedures tightly controlled. And yet, inmates still whisper about a rumored 20th century escape through a ventilation shaft. An unconfirmed Soviet-era incident involving bribed guards. Tales passed between prisoners more out of hope than truth. These stories survive not because they are real, but because they give men something to imagine besides the walls. Why these prisons still matter. Vologda Pyatak and Butyrka represent two extremes of the Russian penal system. Isolation versus overcrowding. Silence versus noise. Routine versus chaos. Finality versus uncertainty. Yet both teach the same lesson. Prisons do not just confine bodies. They reshape souls. Through stories told in letters, memoirs, reports, and interviews, a picture emerges, not of monsters or heroes, but of deeply human struggles. Men trying to survive. Men trying to remember who they were. Men trying not to disappear inside the walls. And these stories are essential because they reveal more than the prisons themselves, they reveal the system that built them, and the society that allows them to endure. In Chapter 4, everything converges. The history. The fear. The psychology. The contradictions. Because the final chapter asks the most important question. What do these prisons say about the nation that created them, and the people who live within their walls? The weight of the walls, what Russia's most feared prisons reveal. To understand a prison is to understand the values, fears, history, and contradictions of the society that built it. And when the prisons in question are Vologda Pyatak and Butyrka, the insight goes deeper than the walls themselves. These institutions are not merely places of confinement, they are mirrors, reflecting centuries of punishment philosophy, political turbulence, and human endurance. This final chapter is not the story of a specific prisoner, guard, or event. It is the story of the system, the unseen architecture of control, fear, ritual, bureaucracy, and survival that binds these facilities together. Because Pyatak and Butyrka are opposites in form, yet twins in function. One isolates. One suffocates. Both crush. Both endure. And both raise a question that Russia, and the world, has wrestled with for decades. What should punishment accomplish? And what happens when the system itself becomes the punishment? The prison as a symbol. Walk the streets of Moscow, and you'll hear Butyrka referenced in slang, stories, and dark humor. Travel through the Vologda region, and locals lower their voices when speaking of Pyatak, as if acknowledging a ghost. Few countries have prisons that loom so heavily in the public imagination. Butyrka, the urban reminder. Butyrka stands at the crossroads of a modern European city, surrounded by traffic, businesses, and people rushing to their day jobs. Yet its heavy gates and century-old walls remain untouched by the pace around them. It reminds citizens that the state sees everything. That justice, or something labeled as justice, can arrive at any time. That within walking distance of coffee shops and offices lies a world of steel doors and sleepless nights. Butyrka makes punishment visible, even if you never step foot inside. Pyatak, the hidden monster. Pyatak, by contrast, is hidden on an island in a cold lake, as if the nation itself cannot bear to look at what happens there. Its isolation is symbolic. Dangerous men are erased from society. Their lives are reduced to routines behind stone walls. Their voices fade. Their histories are frozen in place. Pyatak is punishment through absence, removing a person so completely that only paperwork remembers them. These two prisons, one public and one invisible, reveal a duality in Russian penal philosophy. Some punishments must be witnessed. Others must be hidden. Both serve the same purpose, social control. The legacy of empire, revolution, and state power. To understand these prisons, one must understand the forces that shaped them. Russia's penal system evolved through the Tsarist Empire, revolutions, Stalin's campaigns, Soviet bureaucracy, post-Soviet reforms and regressions. Each era left fingerprints on the walls. Tsarist rule, punishment as exile. Under Catherine the Great and her successors, punishment often meant exile. Sending offenders to Siberia, the Caucasus, or remote monasteries. Pyatak's origins, built upon an old monastic island, echo that tradition. Its isolation feels medieval because, in many ways, it is. The Soviet machine, punishment as control. By the 20th century, prisons were no longer isolated tools, they were instruments of political power. Butyrka held men and women accused of everything from theft to treason. Records, newspapers, and memoirs confirm that during certain periods, the prison overflowed not with criminals, but with political prisoners, dissidents, and innocent people caught in the dragnet of suspicion. Punishment became a method of enforcing unity through fear. Post-Soviet Russia, punishment as stability. After the collapse of the USSR, Russia inherited a massive penal system. Some reforms occurred. Some improvements were mandated by European courts. But many institutions remained intact, their architecture unchanged, their culture deeply rooted. In this era, prisons became symbols of state continuity, proof that despite chaos on the outside, order and discipline still existed somewhere. And that continuity keeps Pyatak and Butyrka alive. The paradox of modernization. Russia has passed reforms aimed at reducing overcrowding, improving oversight, and standardizing conditions. Some progress has been documented in public reports. Yet Pyatak and Butyrka resist change. Why? Because these prisons serve psychological purposes beyond confinement. In Pyatak, the isolation is intentional. In Butyrka, the overcrowding is a byproduct of centralization, a hub through which thousands pass, each carrying the fear of the unknown. Both environments create a punishment experience far harsher than what appears in legal statutes. The state may not openly design cruelty. But the system tolerates it, perhaps because cruelty, or something that resembles it, is seen as part of the social contract. And this creates a paradox. Modern legal language meets ancient punishment philosophy. The chain of fear. Fear runs both directions in these prisons. Inmates fear guards. This is expected. Authority always carries the power to inflict consequences. Guards fear inmates. Less visible, but well documented in interviews conducted by journalists and human rights monitors. Guards fear sudden violence, manipulation, retaliation, unpredictable outbreaks among crowded cells. Guards also fear the system. This is the part outsiders rarely see. Prison staff operate under strict quotas, endless paperwork, rigid protocols, constant oversight from superiors, pressure to maintain order at all costs. Failure can mean dismissal, disciplinary action, or transfer to a more dangerous facility. Inmates fear the system most of all. More than guards. More than each other. Because the system is faceless and immovable. One prisoner interviewed by a Russian newspaper described it like this. A guard can be reasoned with. The system cannot. It does not listen. It does not speak. It simply is. This chain of fear binds everyone, prisoner and staff alike. The unseen cost, families, communities, and memory. Prisoners rarely suffer alone. Their families carry the weight too. For Butyrka families, travel to Moscow is expensive. Waiting for visitation approval can take weeks. Letters are delayed, censored, or lost. Parents die before their sons return home. Children grow up with their fathers behind bars. Partners drift away under the pressure of uncertainty. The system fractures relationships long before sentencing. For Pyatak families, contact is even more difficult. The island's isolation makes visits rare and logistically complex. Inmates may go months or years without seeing a familiar face. Families may go years without knowing the truth of their loved one's condition. One public letter, verified through human rights attorneys, read, "I do not know if he is alive. I only know he is somewhere on that island." The emotional cost of such prisons extends far beyond the inmates themselves. The myth of the worst of the worst. Official records classify Pyatak inmates as highly dangerous, murderers, repeat offenders, escape risks. In Butyrka, by contrast, detainees include both hardened criminals and men accused of minor offenses or completely innocent. Yet a dangerous myth persists. If he's in there, he must deserve it. This misconception simplifies reality. 3 truths challenge it. Not all accusations are accurate. Public records show wrongful detentions, overturned convictions, and political cases. Not all crimes reflect inherent danger. Poverty, addiction, coerced confessions, and systemic pressures lead people to prison for reasons more complex than evil intent. Even dangerous men remain human. Their humanity does not excuse their actions, but neither does confinement erase it. When society embraces the idea that prisoners are not people, the system becomes immune to scrutiny. This belief shields Pyatak and Butyrka from reform. What prisoners carry with them? Men who emerge from these prisons carry scars that rarely heal. From Pyatak, silence. Survivors often struggle with social reintegration, conversation, emotional expression, sensory overload in crowds. The island teaches them to shrink inward. Re-entering a world full of noise becomes almost unbearable. From Butyrka, hypervigilance. Former detainees describe insomnia, distrust, startle responses, anxiety in small spaces, chronic tension. One man said, "Even years later, I still listen for footsteps in the hallway at night." Their bodies have learned to expect danger, even when none exists. The world looks in, but cannot see everything. International human rights organizations have monitored these prisons for years. Reports are detailed, thorough, and publicly accessible. Yet there is a limit. Not because monitors fail, but because these prisons exist behind layers of bureaucracy, tradition, culture, secrecy, physical isolation. Pyatak's stone walls and lake barrier conceal much. Butyrka's high population and rapid turnover obscure patterns. Even with oversight, the truth inside these prisons always remains partly hidden. Because a prison is not just a building. It is an ecosystem, fluid, shifting, alive in ways that statistics cannot fully capture. The resilient few, survival stories. Despite everything, men do survive these prisons. Not all, but some. They survive by maintaining strict routines, building mental resilience, finding religion, forming bonds with cellmates, reading whatever they can access, writing letters they know may never be answered, holding onto small fragments of identity. One Pyatak inmate reportedly spent years carving tiny wooden figures, allowed under supervision. He said the act gave him purpose. A former Butyrka detainee later became a lawyer, dedicating his career to defending those facing pretrial detention. Another wrote a memoir describing his cellmates not as criminals, but as men trying to stay sane in a place that devours sanity. These stories do not erase suffering, but they prove something the system cannot break: the capacity of humans to endure. The future of Pyatak and Butyrka. Will these prisons close? Reform? Transform into museums like so many former European fortresses? There have been discussions, publicly documented, about closing Pyatak due to cost and disrepair. But the plans stalled. There have been repeated proposals to modernize or restructure Butyrka. Some renovations have occurred, but its core remains unchanged. Why such resistance to change? Because these prisons are more than institutions. They are symbols. They represent control, stability, continuity, even when the outside world changes. And symbols are difficult to dismantle. The final contradiction. This series began with contradictions. A peaceful island that houses a fortress of silence. A bustling city hiding a labyrinth of despair. But the final contradiction is the most profound. Prisons are meant to protect society, yet society rarely sees what happens inside them. Pyatak and Butyrka reflect the darkest and brightest capacities of human beings. Cruelty, resilience, indifference, survival, fear, hope. They show how far a system will go to contain danger, and how far people will go to endure it. And they reveal a truth that transcends borders. A prison tells you more about a country than any monument, museum, or parliament building. It shows what a nation fears, what it values, what it is willing to hide, and what it demands from those who break its rules. Pyatak and Butyrka are Russia's mirrors. Cold, unforgiving, but honest, in their own brutal way. Inside their walls lie centuries of secrets, and the stories of men who entered, endured, and were forever changed. Because in the end, a prison is not simply a place where people are sent. It is a place where stories are swallowed, rewritten, or buried. And sometimes, if we are willing to look closely enough, a place where truths escape. In the end, when the final door slams shut and the last echo fades into silence, we're left with a single truth that refuses to look away. Prisons do not simply hold the men inside them. They hold the stories we don't want to confront. They hold the shadows we pretend aren't there. And they hold the reflection of a system built not just on laws, but on fear, order, and history that refuses to die. Russia's most feared prisons, Vologda Pyatak and Butyrka, are separated by hundreds of miles, different centuries, opposite philosophies. One is surrounded by frozen water. The other is surrounded by a city that never sleeps. But both places tell the same story. When society decides a person is too dangerous, too unpredictable, or simply too inconvenient, they disappear into a world most people will never see. A world where time stretches. Where silence or chaos eats at the mind. Where the only constant is the weight of the walls. And yet, behind those walls, life doesn't stop. It changes shape. In Pyatak, a man might watch sunlight crawl across a concrete floor and count the hours not because he wants to, but because it's the only way to remember that time still exists. He might whisper prayers to a God he's not sure is listening. He might cling to memories of a world he no longer believes he'll ever return to. In Butyrka, a detainee might lie awake listening to footsteps in the hall, wondering whether he'll walk out of those gates as a free man, a sentenced man, or a man who will disappear deeper into the system. He might argue with strangers, form alliances, or sit alone in a packed cell feeling more isolated than he ever thought possible. He might learn the unwritten rules, fast, because mistakes cost far more than comfort. And both men, separated by geography and fate, carry one thing in common. A realization that freedom is not the opposite of captivity. Freedom is the awareness of everything you lose the moment a steel door closes behind you. When we talk about punishment, it's easy to speak in absolutes. Crime. Sentence. Consequences. Justice. But inside these prisons, justice is not a word. It's a process. A mechanism. A system built from centuries of conflict, fear, punishment, and power. It is a thing that moves forward even when the people inside it struggle to keep up. Pyatak shows us how far isolation can go, how silence can become its own weapon, sharper and colder than any blade. Butyrka shows us how pressure can shape the human mind, how overcrowding and unpredictability can peel away sanity one restless night at a time. And if these places survive another 100 years, it will be because they continue to serve the same purpose they always have. To remind the public that the state never forgets. And to remind the prisoners that society has chosen a life for them that exists outside the boundaries of the world. But here's the contradiction that lingers long after we leave these stories behind. For all their brutality, these prisons do not fully destroy the people inside them. Some break. But some emerge with a strength forged by confinement. Some become advocates. Some become storytellers. Some become cautionary tales. Some become proof that survival is possible even in places built to extinguish hope. No one walks into Pyatak or Butyrka and emerges unchanged. Not the prisoners. Not the guards. Not the families waiting for news. And not the society that relies on these places to answer questions it cannot answer itself. Because punishment, in the end, is never just about the person who committed the crime. It is about the world they came from. The world they return to. And the world that decides what should happen to those who break its rules. So tonight, as we step away from these walls, the frozen stone of Pyatak and the screaming corridors of Butyrka, we carry something with us. A deeper understanding of what it means to take someone's freedom. A clearer picture of the systems that decide who is redeemed and who is forgotten. And a reminder that behind every locked door is not just a criminal case, but a human life, shaped by choices, circumstances, and a system far older and more complex than any one person inside it. Maybe these prisons will someday close. Maybe they won't. But as long as they stand, on an island lost in fog, or in the heart of a city buzzing with life, they will continue to whisper their warnings through history. That justice is never simple. That punishment is never clean. And that a society reveals its truest self not by how it treats the best of its people, but by how it treats the ones it locks away. This has been the story of Vologda Pyatak and Butyrka. A story of stone, ice, iron, and shadows. A story of men who disappeared, and the walls that remember them. Thank you for walking through the darkness with us. And until the next time you choose to cross the threshold into the world of true crime, remember this. Some prisons are built from stone. Others are built from fear. But the ones that last the longest are the ones we choose not to see.